And I'm going to tell you where things are headed. You ready? Whiteboard time. Well, I'm old enough to remember, as many of you are as well. Let me give you a clearer look here. If you're talking about discrimination, the biggest topic of discrimination was usually white versus black. So there was a time when it was just a white versus black conversation. But as you know, that was not good enough, and that eventually evolved into something called intersectionality. Now, if you're not aware of this term, this is, intersectionality means that you might be discriminated against for more than one reason. For example, you could be black, but also a lesbian. So that's the intersection. And that's important, because the problems of just being black would be different from somebody who's black and LGBTQ. But let's say you could throw disabled in there, people who are differently abled. So you'd have a number of categories, and you could be more than one. You could be several things, right? Now, why is this better? Why is it better to look at intersectionality versus just to see things as race? Well, I'll tell you. Your common sense is very clear on this, which is that it's not close enough. That the people who have these unique problems have problems that are pretty unique, right? If you're Hispanic and LGBTQ and you've got a disability, your situation isn't quite like anybody else's. Would you agree? You have some things in common, but your situation's different. So it makes sense, I think everybody would agree, left and right, it makes more sense to get down to some granularity. So suppose we wanted to improve on this yet again, right? So just looking at black and white, it's too big a category, you can't do enough with it. Go to a little more granularity. Well, you might be black and also this, or this and also that. That's better, wouldn't you say? More granularity. Yeah. If you're going to fix a problem, you want to understand it as well as you can understand it, and this moves you closer to understanding. So what would be the next logical place that this should go if we continue to be rational? People. Or actually, person. Because it's individuals. Individuals. Now, if you understood discrimination and everything else in terms of individuals, which is really where this was getting to. It was getting closer to the individual. But if we go all the way, now we can really do something. Because if this is the problem, white versus black, what are you going to do about it? What's your plan to make that better? Well, there's some things you can do, improving education, et cetera, but doesn't seem to be working. So then getting to more granular, well, maybe we can do something if we understand it at this level, but how about going further? How about going all the way to the individual? Because each of these individuals has unique problems, and it's not just their color and their sexual preference or anything like that. They're just different people. So how about creating a strategy that is the right strategy for each person, which takes into account far more than the discrimination. It takes into account where they live, how old they are, what's their parent situation, is there a good school in your town, what's your personality, what's your character, what things do you need that you don't have. These are all solvable problems. If you give me an individual, they might not take my advice, but I can certainly tell them what to do. I don't know how to solve these other things. Like, I don't know what I could do as an individual. But if a person is in front of me and they're not succeeding in life and they want to know how, I could totally help that person. So I would say that the left and the right were accidentally heading in the same direction, which is the framing of white versus black wasn't getting you enough. What do you do about it? the instinct to go to the next level of detail was the right instinct. It's the right instinct. It just doesn't go far enough. You got to go all the way to what makes every person unique, and then you can solve their problem. Now, here's the persuasion frame on this. Do you notice that there's a whole lot of making you think past the sale in this? Especially the white-black model, but also the intersectionality model. They both have the same characteristic. The characteristic is they ask you to accept that this was the right way to look at it in the first place. If they're making you talk about the difference between black and white performance or outcomes, then they've already made you think past the sale that this was ever the right question in the first place. You see that? So every time somebody gets you into a conversation of outcomes or differences in the average white or average black, they're talking about somebody who doesn't exist. There's no average white person. There's no average black person. There's no average person. We're not just different on race, and we're not just different because we all have some different intersectionality thing going on. We are infinitely different. We are infinitely different. So if you accept any of these frames, you're accepting an absurdity that looking at the average of white people and the average of black people tells you something you could or should do something about. Do you know what I care about the average difference between any two groups? Nothing. I don't care. I have zero interest in fixing this average. Now, that makes me sound like a terrible person, doesn't it? But the reason I have zero interest in this is that it's a trick, and it gives you no solution. It only gives you victimhood and transfer of money. It doesn't give you a system to fix it. So you have a goal. It's a goal. We'd like, different groups to have similar outcomes. That's a good goal. But what's the system? The system you don't really have. Let's say you go to the next level and you complicate it or go down to more granularity. It's moving in the right direction, I think, but it still doesn't give you a system. What are you going to do about it? All right, so you do have an Albanian disabled bisexual. So, and they have different outcomes than the Asian American, non-binaries or something. So, what are you going to do with that? That makes sense, that isn't discriminatory. But let's say you take it to the next level of individuals. So, all right, so individuals have different outcomes. So, Scott, you keep complaining about systems. What's your system just because you divided it this way? Well, my system is sitting behind you. Right there. Now, these are two books that I wrote, but you wouldn't have to buy my books. These are both teaching you how to develop a system for your own personal success. So, if you divide it by individuals, you don't just have a goal, but you have a system. Oh, there are basically skill development books of all kinds. There are probably 10 books that if you read all 10, your odds of succeeding are close to 100%, right? Unless you get sick or you have some terrible bad luck. But if you just did the things that people who are successful advise you to do, and it might not be my advice. I don't call my stuff advice, there's a reason for that. But you have so many different sources for how to fix your individual problem. You also have an infinite number of mentors that would be willing to help. What can a mentor do if you're looking at the world as it's black versus white? What does a mentor do? It's hard to be a mentor in that world, and the same with intersectionality. But the moment you say everybody's infinitely different, and my problem isn't like your problem just because we're both Albanians, I have a different problem than you do. As soon as you go to that, then the systems open up. Oh, Here's a system for building skills. Here's a system for networking. Here's a system for improving your educational outcomes. Here's a system for studying. Here's a system for your fitness, because that helps you in every way. Here's a fitness for your diet, right? Here's a fitness for your appearance. So until you get to the individual level, there's no system solution, and this cries for a system solution. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is my whiteboard for today. And I would further encourage you, if you want this kind of frame to be the dominant one, that when somebody tries to bait you into a conversation about the average difference between black and white performance, tell them you're not interested. But tell them you are very interested in the success of any individual, for which you could probably help with some advice. I mean, if the only thing you did is say, hey, you need help succeeding? Yes, I do. Well, I'm not much of a mentor, but I could recommend 5 books that would really get you going. So every one of you can be a mentor just because you know of a book to recommend. Probably more than one. Right? So do not buy into the frame of what the average non-existent imaginary person is doing compared to the average non-existent other person is doing. Just don't buy in. Don't let them make you think past the sale. Individuals are the only frame that's worth talking about. Everything else is political manipulation.